bless you, Lord. Lord, now indeed I find Thy power and Thine alone can change the leper's spots and melt the heart of stone. Jesus paid all to Him I owe. Sin and leper, Christmas Day, He washed it white as snow. For nothing good have I, whereby Thy grace to lay. I'll wash my garments white in the blood of Calvary's Lamb. Jesus paid it all to Him I owe. Sin and leper, Christmas Day, He washed it white as snow. And when before the throne I stand in Him complete, Jesus died my soul to save, my lips shall still repeat. Jesus paid it all to Him I owe. Sin and leper, crimson stain, He washed it white as snow. Jesus paid it all to Him I owe. Sin and leper, crimson stain, He washed it white as snow. There is a fountain filled with blood drawn from Emmanuel's veins, and sinners plunged beneath that flood lose all their guilty stains, lose all their guilty stains, lose all their guilty stains, and sinners plunged beneath that flood lose all their guilty stains. Dear dying Lamb, Thy precious blood shall never lose its power, till all the ransom church silent in the grave. Then in a nobler, sweeter song, I'll sing thy power to save. I'll sing thy power to save. I'll sing thy power to save. Then in a nobler, sweeter song, I'll sing thy power to save. I'll sing thy power to save. I'll sing thy power to save. Then in a nobler, sweeter song, I'll sing thy power to save. I'll sing thy power to save.
All to Jesus I surrender. All to Him I freely give. I will ever love and trust Him in His presence daily live. All to Jesus I surrender. Humbly at His feet I bow. Worldly pleasures all forsaken. Take me, Jesus, take me now. Singing I surrender all. Oh, I surrender all to Thee, my blessed Savior. I surrender all. Surrender all to You, Lord. All to Jesus all to Jesus I surrender. Make me Savior, Holy One. Let me feel that Holy Spirit. Holy Spirit, truly know that Thou art mine. I surrender all. I surrender Just lift it up to him. Sing it again.
My worth is not in what I own, not in the strength of flesh and bone, but in the costly wounds of love at the cross. My worth is not in skill or name, in win or lose, pride or shame, but in the blood of Christ that flowed at the cross. And I rejoice in my Redeemer, greatest treasure, wellspring of my soul. And I will trust in him, no other. My soul is satisfied.
Hey, good evening, everyone, and welcome to another installment of our book study on Jesus for President by Shane Claiborne and Chris Haw. We're glad that you're here joining us tonight on Facebook Live. We're going to go through a couple of things here tonight, as if you didn't already have enough of presidential politics this week with the debates on Tuesday and how do I put this kindly? The circus show that was, but we are back here again to compare and contrast a new version and a new vision for what God's politics and what a true allegiance to Jesus would be all about. So we are glad that you are here and joining us today. We're going to be going through section 2 of the book tonight. We had a couple of very specific questions that we're going to be honing in on, and those will help guide our discussion tonight. But we don't need to limit ourselves to these questions either. These are questions that are to give us food for thought and help us to provoke some dialogue along the way. But if you have any questions that you just want to ask as we go through our guide here tonight, maybe things that came up for you as you were reading through section 2, feel free to ask those. We have the Q&A box that is open, and you can put those questions right in there. Or if that, for whatever reason, is not working for you, if you're working on a phone or your iPad and you can't quite get to that, then you can also use the comments section as well, and we will try to get to those questions as we go along. Full confession here, I did have a video segment that I wanted to show tonight, but with other things that came up, we didn't have that ready. However, we will try to have that ready for you next week here, and it will still be relevant to what it is that we're talking about when we get into section 3 of the book. But so for tonight, as we start off, and it's the beginning of our first question, and I think it's important for us to read through this here as we understand what Jesus' vision for the kingdom was all about when we talk about a new kind of candidate here in section 2. So we're going to start off reading through, and I invite you to hear these words of the Beatitudes, the beginning of the Beatitudes, from chapter 5 of Matthew's Gospel. And think of these things in light of what we were reading today, or in this past week, I should say, and what we'll touch on here today, when it comes to what it means to live in the kingdom of God and what that is supposed to be all about, and what Jesus is saying to Israel and what that can say to us now, and let that guide our discussion going forward. So, from Matthew chapter 5, we read in what is commonly known as the Beatitudes. And it starts off with a series of blessings. Luke's version of this actually has curses along with it too, but we won't get into that. And then we have two very familiar stories to us that we'll read through, and then we'll unpack those as well as we get into what Shane says about that. So, chapter 5, beginning with verse 1. When Jesus saw the crowds, he went up to the mountain and sat down, and his disciples came to him. Then he began to speak and taught them, saying, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled. Blessed are the merciful, for they will receive mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God. Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when people revile you and persecute you and utter all kinds of evil against you falsely on my account. Rejoice and be glad, for your reward is great in heaven. For in the same way they persecuted the prophets who were before you. You are the salt of the earth. But if salt has lost its taste, how can its saltiness be restored? It is no longer good for anything, but is thrown out and trampled underfoot. You are the light of the world. A city built on a hill cannot be hid. No one, after lighting a lamp, puts it under a bushel basket, but on a lampstand, and gives light to all in the house. In the same way, let your light shine before others, so that they may see your good works and give glory to your Father in heaven. Do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have come not to abolish, but to fulfill. For truly I tell you, until heaven and earth pass away, not one letter, not one stroke of a letter will pass from the law until all is accomplished. Therefore, whoever breaks one of the least of these commandments and teaches others to do the same will be called the least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever does them and teaches them will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. For I tell you, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and the Pharisees, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. You've heard it said you have heard that it was said to those of ancient times, you shall not murder, and whoever murders shall be liable to judgment. But I say to you that if you are angry with a brother or sister, you will be liable to judgment. And if you insult a brother or sister, you will be liable to the council. And if you say, you fool, you will be liable to the hell of fire. So when you are offering your gift at the altar, if you remember that your brother or sister has something against you, leave your gift there before the altar and go. First be reconciled to your sister or brother, and then come and offer your gift. Come to terms quickly with your accuser while you are on the way to court with him, or your accuser may hand you over to the judge, and the judge to the guard, and you will be thrown into prison. Truly I tell you, you will never get out until you have paid the last penny. You have heard it said that you shall not commit adultery, but I say to you that everyone who looks at a woman with lust has already committed adultery with her in his heart. If your right eye causes you to sin, tear it out and throw it away. It is better for you to lose one of your members than for your whole body to be thrown into the pit. And if your right hand causes you to sin, cut it off and throw it away. For it is better for you to lose one of your members than for your whole body to go into hell. It was, gosh, I can't read tonight. It was also said, whoever divorces his wife, let him give her a certificate of divorce. But I say to you that anyone who divorces his wife, except on the grounds of unchastity, causes her to commit adultery, and whoever marries a divorced woman commits adultery. Again, you have heard that it was said to those of ancient times, you shall not swear falsely, but carry out the vows that you have made to the Lord. But I say to you, do not swear at all, either by heaven, for it is the throne of God, or by earth, for it is his footstool, or by Jerusalem, for it is the city of the great king. And do not swear by your head, for you cannot make one hair white or black. Let your word be yes, yes, or no, no. Anything more than this comes from the evil one. You have heard that it was said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, but I say to you, do not resist an evildoer. But if anyone strikes you on the right cheek, turn the other also. And if anyone wants to sue you to take your coat, give your cloak as well. And if anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go also the 2nd mile. Give to everyone who begs from you, and do not refuse anyone who wants to borrow from you. You have heard that it was said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I say to you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, so that you may be children of your Father in heaven. For he makes his sun rise on the evil and the good, and sends rain on the righteous and on the unrighteous. For if you love those who love you, what reward do you have? Do not even the tax collectors do the same? And if you greet only your brothers and sisters, what more are you doing than others? Do not even the Gentiles do the same? Be perfect, therefore, as your heavenly Father is perfect. Jesus goes on in this Sermon on the Mount, but the Beatitudes and the continuation of that with the you have heard it said form a big bulk of what Shane was talking about today. When we compare and we contrast what Jesus was all about in bringing in the kingdom of heaven as opposed to the world that he was born in. And not only the world that was occupied by Rome, but also those who were in charge of Israel at the time, of Judea at the time, who were essentially the puppets of Rome, and what his message was and how it was a countercultural message. So, as we use that as a jumping off point tonight, let's examine that question a little bit more, and hopefully you've had a chance to do that already. Consider Jesus' teaching about life in his world from the Beatitudes, from the entirety of the Sermon on the Mount, and how do they compare to our social, political, national and global militaristic attitudes. When we hear those blessings, and when we hear those you have heard it said, how does that really compare and contrast to our world today? I'll give folks a few minutes to go in if you haven't already. Excuse me. And hopefully you've got some questions ready to go. Anything coming in? Okay. Well, let's take a look while we're thinking about that. I want to share something that Shane points out when we talk about, and as he says at the beginning, the Christmas story, but it shapes how Jesus' interpretation of the Beatitudes actually is mimicking and mirroring the political backdrop of the time frame. And let's go through a couple of those pieces there. And one is the language that is used even in Jesus' birth. So when we compare the imperial language of what Jesus was born into, there's a couple of things that are important to know. The words empire or the words kingdom. The Greek word for that's used in the New Testament is called basileia, or a kingdom, an empire, a realm. And in terms here, in imperial language, it's used to describe the Roman Empire, and at its head is Caesar. Here, Jesus' most common topic of conversation is the kingdom of God or the kingdom of heaven, and at its head is Yahweh, is God, who liberated the Israelites from slavery. Gospel, good news, euangelion is the word that we use, that is in the Greek, I should say, that we translate into gospel, which literally means good news or to bring good news. I've often said this too, that when we talk about gospel, when we talk about good news, versus being evangelical or evangelism, because of the politically charged term that has come around to, all of us are actually evangelicals, because all we're simply doing is trying to bring good news to people. But that had different connotations even in Jesus' day, just as it does for us today, even in religious circles. So one who brought good news was usually an imperial pronouncement, a euangelion, usually accompanied by flags and political ceremony, and that an heir to the empire, an heir to the throne was born, or that a distant battle had been won. In this case, it's the good news that Jesus brings of the coming of the kingdom of God that is at hand. Christos, Christ, or Messiah, as it's actually a Greek translation of the Hebrew word Messiah. In the Roman world, it was known as the name that Jews used for their ruler, who was anointed by God and the people, and the King of the Jews' job title had already been granted to Herod. Hence the problem when Jesus was also considered to be a king of the Jews. Only one person at a time can fit on a throne. So expression of being commissioned or appointed is also the word for Christ or Christos, especially by divine authority. And precisely how folks thought of the Roman emperors literally means that they were dripped by the gods as anointed with oil. In our context, Christ or Christos, or the Hebrew word that it comes from, Messiah, means a divinely anointed ruler over Israel who would fulfill the scriptural promises of saving the Israelites from oppression and from themselves. While a primary title for Jesus, this is also the name that was used for David and other rulers. Messiah does not mean, as it is commonly mistaken to mean, that God beamed down to earth and squeezed into human flesh, but rather a divinely mandated royal person or man. We might understand Jesus as the incarnate deity, but Messiah had very different political connotations in a historical role. And so with that approach, we also look at the names. So when we talk about someone being the Son of God, that was a title that was given to kings and emperors. The Roman emperor was considered to be the son of a god. Alexander the Great, the Greek Empire, also used this same type of title, and is also then applied that to the term Caesar, which then later Caesar Augustus came up. Son of God is obviously the name that we ascribe to Jesus, and Jesus actually spoke of himself as the Son of Man, or the human one, which is a term that was borrowed from, the prophet Daniel. And it was also used by the tempter in the desert to reference tempting a king. The other one that I think is important for us, and the word here that we use is, the Greek word I should say, is ecclesia. That translates into English, church. The ecclesia was a gathered group of people. And in the Roman Empire, it was a local public assembly, much like a town gathering, and the assemblies bestowed citizenship, discussed local political concerns, and assigned elders. and offer prayer and worship to Caesar. There was no separation of religion or secular political business. We use that word church, and the early Christians adopted that ecclesia, and that emphasizes that the followers of Jesus were called to participate in their world as local communities of an alternative society to the Roman imperial order. So their churches, their ecclesia, their gatherings were meant to be a countercultural act than what was happening in the empire. They bestowed alternative citizenship and as assigned by elders, and though it discussed its own political and religious concerns, it was understood to be separate from and in contrast to the state and the politics, their politics and their religion. So against this backdrop, and there are others as well, this is how we understand Jesus coming into the world. So what we read here then is that on page 71, that this political language does not harmonize with the contemporary church project of reclaiming America for God. In fact, precisely the opposite. Jesus was urging his followers to be the unique, peculiar, and set-apart people that began with Abraham. He didn't pray for the world in order to make governments more religious. He called Israel to be the light of the world, to abandon the way of the world and cultivate an alternative society in the shell of the old, not merely to be a better version of the kingdoms of this world. And so again, when we read in Matthew 7, and Jesus starts off, and he first says, "You're the salt of the earth," and then he goes on to say, "the light of the world." But notice what he says in there too. He says, "You are the salt of the earth." But if you have lost your saltiness and it has no taste, it's not good for anybody and it throws out, and it has to be thrown away. What he is saying there is that the salt, which we know, is not only something that we add for taste, but salt also is a preservative and keeps things pure and keeps things whole. So if Israel is to be the salt of the earth, if they have lost their saltiness and given it away to the empire, if you will, then they are no good, and it has to be thrown out with everything else. And then he admonishes them even further, and this is the one that we as Christians take on, and I think we've lost the connotation and the meaning of it. N.T. Wright, who is now a bishop in the Church of England, but a modern New Testament biblical scholar, had this to say about it. We read it wrong when we say, "You are the light of the world," but we don't hide it under a bushel basket. We need to let our light shine for the whole world to see. And we so internalized it, and we think to ourselves that, gee, that's nice. Jesus said that I'm the light of the world, and we don't want to hide it under a basket. We want it, so I'm going to do that. And then we've even come up with a great Sunday school song for it. This little light of mine, I'm going to let it shine. This little light of mine, and hide it under a bushel. No, I'm going to let it shine. And we just think, oh, isn't that wonderful? But N.T. Wright says we should read it this way. You're the light of the world. Why are you hiding it under a basket? You're supposed to be the example. Let your light shine for all the world to see. Comes across very differently there. But that's the point that Jesus is making. He's not trying to help them feel good. He is urging Israel to go on and take action, even in the political reality that they find themselves. So we'll come back to that question here today. How do these Beatitudes, how do they compare to our social and political or global attitudes that we have, or even our militaristic attitudes that we have? Maybe you got some other questions or comments here as well. One thing that I think we can say about that is that when we hear about those blessings and when we hear about those you have heard it said, we have to look so in the context of what does it mean to be taking care of and serving the least of these? How is our society, and I'll use this phrase here, does pull yourself up by your bootstraps fit in with the Beatitudes? Let's think about that, and maybe we can come back to it as well. The second question that we do have out here is to think about our prophetic voice to culture around us as it relates to our own political imagination. How does this affect our relevance or our peculiarity as people? Jesus was kind of a peculiar person, and we are called to be peculiar people when it comes to how it is that we relate to the world. And I think Shane helps us to understand that when we get into the discussing of, what is Jesus' message bringing, and how is it that we are to relate to it there? John the Baptizer, remember when he talks about him, is a herald for what the world is supposed to be like. Now, John the Baptizer has a specific beef with not just Herod Antipas, as we know, but it's a beef with the structures that have been built up around that in the name of legitimacy of Israel. So John the Baptizer does something different. He is out in the wilderness. He's out in the desert. He's wearing camel's hair tied around with a leather belt, and rather than eating lavish meals like the Herods of the world or the Pharisees, he's eating locusts and wild honey. And he's the one who is saying, come out of everything that is happening in Jerusalem or what you think is going on here, and prepare the way for the Lord, make straight his paths, and come and be baptized out in the desert, along the Jordan River, but still out in the wilderness, desert, if you will, and be forgiven of your sins. And it was that backdrop that Jesus himself came to John and be baptized in order to fulfill his part of the mission. And when he does that, then we get into those temptations that Jesus comes into. And I like this quote because, again, he's one of my favorite Christian artists that Shane says here on page 82. It says, in one of the moments when he was uncomfortably honest in ways Christian artists are not supposed to be, the late Rich Mullins talked about his vulnerabilities. He said usually he didn't really want to sin, but he just wanted to be tempted real good by all that the world had to offer. Then he could know what he was saying no to. And I think that's an important thing for us to think about. When we talk about our own political imagination and how it affects our relevance and our peculiarity, do we know what we are saying no to? And how are we saying no to that? One of the things that struck me when we talk about politics, as I studied with Stanley Hauerwas at Duke Divinity School, and we began to touch on hot-button political issues that the church was when it came to Christian ethics. That was the course that we were dealing with. And he was the professor for the practice of Christian ethics. He's written numerous books and is such an interesting man who I admire so much. And while we all have our disagreements, he always approached this from stop thinking as the way the world thinks. We have to have a bigger imagination than the political one we've been crafted into. In particular, he brought up the topic of abortion. Now, without getting too much in the weeds, he threw this statement out that when we began to talk about that. And he said this: that abortion is God's judgment upon the church. That gets everybody's attention there right away. Wait, what? Abortion is God's judgment on the church. Wait, the church is supposed to be against this, right? Or we think we are anyway. How is abortion God's judgment on the church? And then he follows that up by saying, it's God's judgment on the church because in the church, there should never be allowed to be the concept of such a thing as an unwanted child. Now, there's nuance in all of that, and I don't want to dive us too deep into the weeds on that, other than to say for the shock value and about how our political imagination affects our relevance and our peculiarity. We form our arguments about whether we are for or against something a lot of times not based upon what we think the right thing to do as an alternative society, as an alternative to the options that the world has to offer us. We oftentimes are co-opted into the political realms that already dominate us. And sometimes those political opinions are dominated into the religion to where they become indistinguishable. And so that's where our call is to be relevant. So, we got any answers or other questions coming in here? No? Guys, is this thing on? We want it to be interactive. I don't want to have Steve the talking head here. Or if you have another question, don't focus on these four that we do have here. If you have another question, feel free to bring it up as well. I'll take a moment and take a drink here while we're waiting. So while we're thinking about that some more, let me pull up the idea of what that political peculiarity looks like there. When we talk about Jesus after his baptism, and in Matthew's gospel, Jesus is baptized, he goes out into the wilderness, he is tempted, and then he goes about his public ministry and gives the Sermon on the Mount, in which we just read there. In Luke's gospel, the order is a little bit different there. Jesus goes and he is baptized. He goes into his temptations, but then Jesus calls his disciples, and then we eventually get to what Luke calls the Sermon on the Plain. But that's neither here nor there, because Shane's focusing on Luke's version of Jesus' temptation in the wilderness. And so what we hear is a parallel of what Jesus' temptations are and the political temptations of Israel. And I thought this statement was good again here on page 82. The tempter's best lie is 99% true. And his or her greatest strategy is getting us to settle for less than God's dream or for a subtle distortion of it. I'll read that again. The tempter's best lie is 99% true. And his or her greatest strategy is getting us to settle for less than God's dream or for a subtle distortion of it. So when Jesus is resisting the temptations, he's actually talking about the social and political temptations that are involved with that too. It's hard for us in the 21st century here to put ourselves back into that situation. But the original readers of the Gospels and the audience that Jesus was saying himself would know exactly what he was talking about. And on page 83, when Shane says, Jesus resisted the temptation of food in this case, where he says, people do not live on bread alone. Remembering the Exodus people in the desert, Jesus knew that bread from heaven was not about miracles, but was a test. to see whether Israel could resist the Egyptian imperial economics of hoarding. The temptation, which he talked about in the last section, to return to Pharaoh's economy is a wound in the Israelites' historical identity, and Jesus was trying to cure it. So again, how is our prophetic voice to culture around us as it relates to our political imagination? How does it affect our relevance and our peculiarity? Or does it diminish it? Or does it at all? Okay, we're all quiet tonight, huh? I know this is a lot of stuff too, and we're thinking through a lot of things here as well. Let's go through the next temptation there, and then that'll take us to into question 3. But let's look at the next temptation here, where Jesus is shown all the kingdoms of heaven. Luke and Matthew actually have these reversed if you read in their in the two different gospels there. First, in Matthew, Jesus is tempted to throw himself down, and then he is tempted with the kingdoms. Here in Luke, he is tempted with the bread, stones into bread, and then he is tempted with the kingdoms of heaven, and then he is tempted at the pinnacle of the temple. So, and when he says, I will give you all their authority and their splendor, because it has been given to me, and I can give it to anyone I want to. If you worship me, it will all be yours. But Shane, I think, sums it up far better than I ever could here as well, where he says, unsurprisingly, given the Jewish story, the temptation was to take power back from Rome, to reform Rome, and to usurp its political power. Just as Israel was tempted in 1 Samuel 8 to become like the other nations and install a king, Jesus was tempted with a throne. The devil used the title Son of God or Son of Man, using them interchangeably, raising the question of what kind of a king Jesus would be. He could be one that would overthrow Rome and knock Caesar off his throne and punish all of the enemies of the Jewish people. But instead, as Shane puts it, he saw governmental power not as a coveted position to run after, but rather as the devil's playground. Jesus' ancestors had suffered from the bloodshed and the hunger and the pain inflicted by kings and empires. He knew how the powers had killed the prophets before him, and so he abandoned himself to the imperial cross. So when Jesus is tempted with all of the kingdoms, we have to also understand how Jesus is setting up the example of what the kingdom of heaven is like, and how that compared and contrast with the world that they found themselves living in. And that takes us into question 3, to think about how we are impacted by our American culture, thinking through how we have absorbed a different theology than that of Christ's. How have we been occupied? How are we so encapsulated by the culture we don't even know it? I think one of the things for me is, again, and it goes back to a common theme that I've raised over and over again, where we have somehow tried to create us and them, either and or. When we talk about having Jesus for president, and we talk about what it means for Jesus to be our leader, we want to oftentimes reduce that to political power. And if we have our way, then we will be able to just simply turn things back to the right, if you will. And that's not what it's all about. You've probably heard it said, how can you be a Christian and support one political party or the other political party? And my question is, in the end, what do the political parties have to do with being a Christian, being a follower of Jesus. We confuse ourselves with the politics of our day and find the one that closely fits into our own personal understanding and say, yes, that's what it means to follow Jesus. Because, well, let's just take abortion, for example. We've been talking about, I brought it up already. So therefore, if this party is against it, then therefore we as a church should be against it, and the church is against it, and I'll use the church, small c. And so therefore, that's the party of Jesus. Is it really? One of the things that I have found is that everything has nuance. And I hope as you've been reading through the book here, especially in light of what Shane has been bringing up the historical context of which Jesus entered into and what his ministry was all about, and how that ministry compared and contrasted with the political reality that he faced, both for Israel, but also for the occupiers of Rome. That we have to aspire to something higher than that. Now, it does not mean we don't have to participate in the political system, far from that. But it means that our politics is not informed by what one party or the other says, but is informed by how we view the world through the lens of Jesus and his ministry, and the calling that we have to be inheritors and bringers of the kingdom of heaven. That's a whole different thing. And when we see that, we have to reimagine the world in a very different way than right and left, Democrats and Republicans, or libertarians or Greens. I'm not going to leave out the third parties here. However it is that you look at it, it forces us to reimagine it in such a different way. We got a question that's come in. Wonderful, or a response here. So that's great. Let's get to that. Gail, our church's recognition of LGBT rights is directly related to current political events. Very interesting. Especially with a fear and a new court nominees may move with other conservative justices to eliminate these rights. Interesting. I think, Gail, you bring up a good point. A lot of what is happening is related to current political events. And it's interesting where sometimes the church mirrors our politics, and then sometimes our politics mirrors where the church is going. And that's where we run into the danger of having these things as being indistinguishable. But I think on the whole, and if you want to look, if you say our church and using the capital C, not Newberg's stance, but the General United Methodist Church's stance, which still right now is anti-LGBT and denies full inclusion. And that is related to the political events. But again, it's one of those things that we have picked and chosen to do. We look in the Bible and we say, oh my gosh, it's right in there, it says that, and so therefore we must be against it, and we're going to rally around a political party that is also against that because that's what they're campaigning on. But what are their ends and what are their means? Our ends is the kingdom of God. And what we also find is that we can always point to one particular scripture to justify our own biases and prejudices. But as we look throughout the whole Bible, we realize that there is nuance. And in fact, that there is a progression. So while one thing may have been said in one section of the Old Testament, in this case here, something new comes along. And God says, and specifically says, I am doing a new thing. And that's what Jesus is the ultimate manifestation of. How God is doing a new thing, this time with the idea of redemption of the world and for the idea of ushering in the kingdom of heaven. Now, when you say there's a fear and potentially with new court nominees that might eliminate some of these rights, that is true. In fact, I was having a conversation with that about somebody, member of another church, another United Methodist church as well, and he was saying that the only thing that we have protecting these are judicial decisions here, interpretations of things like the 14th Amendment, of having equal protection under the law, and a tertiary reading of the full faith and credit clause as well in our Constitution. But again, I'll go back to Hauerwas here for a second. When he talked about marriage, and again, we can get into the whole thing that Jesus even says in the Beatitudes about marriage or adultery and divorce. But we have to look at it through the lens of what it was in that time. Adultery, of course, is forbidden, and nobody is condoning that. But then Jesus ties it into divorce. But he's tying it into divorce in terms of the understanding of what it means to take care of the people in society that you are charged to take care of. Without getting into the weeds too much, marriage that was based upon mutual love and respect for one another was not always the case back in that day. And in fact, for a lot of our history, especially with those in the upper echelons of society, arranged marriage was a thing. And what Jesus is saying there is that we don't do these things on a whim. We take care of the people who are most vulnerable in society. And if we don't have that enshrined, then we run the risk of losing those things. So while the United Methodist Church is moving in a different direction, Hauerwas went so far as to say that when we talk about marriage, and he just gave a warning, not that I necessarily agree with it entirely, but he had said, all of you pastors, we're not so much concerned about the legal status of somebody for their tax purposes, concerned about how they are going to live their lives in a monogamous, lifelong covenant relationship. So don't ever sign a marriage license. Now, I go ahead and sign those things, but as I always explain to my couples as well, I'm glad that you have that, and I'm happy to do that as a courtesy to you for the state, and it'll help you out. But I'm more concerned about why you want to make a commitment to one another before God, and that's why you're here at a church. So, even to take that a step further, what does that mean for us as a church to say that we can offer things to one person but not another? And that's where Newburgh Church has come down, is to say that we believe that God has been working with us throughout society and has created people to love whoever they are called to love, but we are concerned not about what one peculiar scripture passage says, but we're concerned about how does this work in the kingdom of heaven? And how do we help everybody to live in that lifelong covenant? But it is a very real thing, because when we get back down to the heart of it, when we talk about discrimination, if we codify and legalize discrimination, then we are no better than any of the empires that have come before. And that's where we in the church can have a voice to talk about what we believe is right in the kingdom of heaven. Now the church, small c again, disagrees on that. The United Methodist Church currently right now disagrees on that. Unfortunately, it's going to next year, we were going to do it this year, but next year it's going to lead to a split within the denomination. But in the end, what we'll be able to do is to put some of this fighting and bickering behind, and we can get about doing the things that help us to include and to love one another in a Jesus way there. So thank you for bringing that up, Gail. I think that's an important piece there. And so when we get back to how we're impacted by our American culture and how we've absorbed the different theology than that of Christ's and have somehow meshed it together, I think we have to remember that what he says here, and Shane goes to this: instead of ascending to the throne of power to establish God's society, he would descend into the world as a slave, Jesus' rebuke was, "It is written, worship the Lord your God and serve only him." To serve God alone is to refuse to take the reins of world power. Serving God alone is another way of praying, "Your kingdom come." So, when Jesus is tempted with those things, it's a reminder of where what we're truly working for and what our true kingdom lie. And then Shane goes on to say this, that I think is really good, that Jesus would make for a bad president. It's hard to imagine Jesus wearing a God Bless Rome t-shirt and promoting his campaign with stickers and buttons and a $100 million campaign. And he would be considerably uncomfortable as commander-in-chief of the largest military in the world. Nevertheless, he was political. All of his titles granted him political authority. Calling him Messiah or Lord is like acclaiming him, unlikely as it is, as a president. He was the president who did not want to be president, and his politics aspired to something different from state power. So now, when we look at that and who Jesus was, I'm going to have to skip ahead here to the next part of the book. And that takes us to question 4. To compare Caesar's coronation with Jesus' coronation. And I hope you had a chance to read through that section there, because you can see the parallels that are drawn, but also the contrasting that is drawn about what it means to be a king, to be an emperor, to be a ruler, and for Jesus to take his coronation and the somewhat, I will say, in your face, but also countercultural process that Jesus comes about. When he says this, to lead it off there, the Christian, I'm on page 125 here. The Christians in the Roman Empire recognized the power and devotion of the imperial cult. They also recognized that you could not serve the God of the empire and the God of Jesus. This is why they did not choose small language to communicate about Jesus. Language such as, it's just personal spiritual conviction, not political. No, they chose language and imagery with the weight of the empire behind their words. But probably the most poignant language in the Gospels that contrasts Jesus with the powers of his day is that of his crucifixion story in Mark. And so when we read that, and then he quotes here Ray Vander Laan, who gives the 8 steps of the inauguration of a Caesar. And then when we read these steps and the powerful satirical method that Mark uses to paint what he sees as the true inauguration of Jesus. So those steps are: the Praetorian Guard, usually about 6,000 soldiers, gathered in the Praetorium. The would-be Caesar was brought into the middle of the gathering. And then the second step, guards went to the temple of Jupiter Capitolinus. Say that 3 times real fast. Got a purple robe, placed it on the candidate. The candidate was also given an olive wreath made of gold and a scepter of the authority of Rome. Caesar was loudly acclaimed as triumphant by the Praetorian Guard. A procession began through the streets of Rome, led by soldiers. In the middle was Caesar. Walking behind him was a sacrificial bull, whose death and blood would mark Caesar's entrance into the divine pantheon. Walking next to the bull was a slave who carried an axe to kill the bull. Some accounts note that some people would spread sweet-smelling incense around the procession. The 5th step, procession moved onto the highest hill in Rome, the Capitoline Hill, and on this hill was the temple. The candidate stood before the temple altar and was offered by the slave a bowl of wine mixed with myrrh. He took it as if to accept and then gave it back. The slave also refused, and then the wine was poured out either onto the altar or onto the bull. Right after the wine was poured, the bull was killed. The Caesar-to-be gathered his second in command on his right hand and his third in command on his left. Then they ascended to the throne of the Capitolium. The crowd acclaimed the inaugurated emperor, and for the divine seal of approval, the gods would send signs such as a flock of doves or a solar eclipse. You see where this is going, don't you? If you're familiar with the story. So then, comparing that with Jesus' coronation. Jesus was brought to the praetorium in Jerusalem, and the whole company of soldiers, at least 200, gathered there. Soldiers brought Jesus a wreath of thorns, a scepter, an old stick, and a purple robe. Sarcastically, the soldiers acclaimed, mocked, and paid homage to Jesus. The procession began, but instead of a bull, the would-be king and God became the sacrifice, the bull. But he could not carry the instrument of death and be the sacrifice. So they stopped Simon, father of Alexander and Rufus, who were later young believers in the church of Rome, and gave him the cross. Jesus was led up to Golgotha. In Aramaic, Golgotha is not precisely the skull hill. That's actually Calvary. But nonetheless, it's the top hill, the biggest hill there. So he was again led to the highest hill in Jerusalem. Jesus was offered wine, and he refused, and right after it is written, and they crucified him. Next came the account of those being crucified on his right and on his left. The word from them, lestes, means terrorist or insurrectionist. And Jesus was again acclaimed, mocked, and a divine sign confirmed God's presence. The temple curtain was ripped in two. And in other accounts, the whole sky became darkened, tombs burst open, and the dead walked about. Finally, the Roman guard, who undoubtedly pledged allegiance to Caesar, the other Son of God, was converted and acclaimed this man as the Son of God. So we see the similarities of Jesus' coronation with a coronation of a Caesar. So what are the similarities and contradictions within our present political system as Christians? We're in an election season right now, and we have some expectations that we have supposedly always had. And we're finding that those norms are being violated right now. And that was never more fully on display than it was on Tuesday night, where decorum was not the rule of the day, where the exchange of ideas about what it is that even we think in this country should be the best ones put forward, but instead was reduced to a shouting match of interruptions, which is probably the politest way of putting it. And many people, many in the news media, myself as a historian and a political science degree in my undergrad background, looked at that as well and said, I don't think we have ever seen anything like this in our history, at least not in our modern history. But is that what we are coming down to? Are we mocking the system? And how can we as followers of Jesus demand something better that's within our present political systems as Christians? Any questions, comments on that? I'll give you a second. Nothing, huh? I know it's deep and I know it's challenging, and sometimes we can't think of the right things to say. So, but what I do want to say too is that as we talk about all of this stuff, and I know we go over some of these things in class, but I encourage you to do your reading, and if you think of something, take a note, write it down, and we'll be happy to answer those as well. Even as we have some of these questions that we have already prepared for us going forward. So to get to tonight and talk about a little bit more about what I think, for me, this is the meat of what we're talking about here tonight when we talk about how it is that we as Christians look at the world, and particularly even in our political debates, as what we saw on Tuesday night has shaped a lot of what we think or what we have been conditioned to think. In the last quarter century or so, we've been conditioned to cynically think of politicians as all just a bunch of crooks. And in fact, a friend of mine said, this is the example for all, and he used the term, all you Kool-Aid drinkers out there, and I mean of both parties, about why this is all just a mockery here. Now, I tend to think that at its best, our government can be used for bringing about the greater good. That's in our founding documents. But then I think also we as Christians, and this kind of gets into what Paul is saying when he gets into participating in the systems that you're in, not so that you can take them over, but so that our witness can be carried out into the world. And one of those things is that we as Christians can demand better. And when in the Sermon on the Mount, when Jesus goes on to explain in those subsequent chapters there, I want to touch on a couple of things that Jesus says, in particularly getting into the 7th chapter. And he says he gives 3 real examples of how to interact with our adversaries. And in each instance, Jesus points us towards disarming others. And Jesus teaches us to refuse to oppose evil on its own terms. He invites us to transcend both passivity and violence through a third way. And I think that's really important for us as Christians. And that's how we can inform how we participate in our politics right here and right now. And the first one, which we always say is, we always point to, we've heard about the story of turning the other cheek. And he says, and explains in that culture, in that time, and I know Reverend Gassaway did a whole sermon on this too, that by turning the other cheek, the person made the abuser look them in the eye, and the abuser could now only hit them with a fist as an equal. By turning the other cheek, the other person said, I am a human being made in the image of God, and you cannot destroy that. Don't cower and punch back, but make sure the person looks into your eyes and sees your sacred humanity, and it will become increasingly harder for that person to hurt anyone, let alone you. Then the other thing Shane talks about when he says, when someone makes you go a mile with them and to walk another, and that seems strange to us. Now, for somebody as a runner who plans out their mileage, although my mileage has diminished in the last few years, but I've got to work back on that. That's oftentimes what we talk about going the let's go one more. How far are we going today? And then usually you can get a running partner or somebody, one of your folks, to say, hey, let's go that extra mile. And we've even turned that into a phrase, go the extra mile. Be a pal, be a good person. But put that in the light of the first century, it was common for anyone to be forced into walking a mile with a Roman soldier, with your occupier, with your oppressor. And as Shane says, with no Humvees or tanks, soldiers traveled on foot and carried large amounts of gear, so they depended on civilians to carry their supplies. And there are probably many zealots who were listening to Jesus who threw a fist in the air when they were asked to walk with a soldier. And Roman law did specify that they had to walk 1 mile, but that was it. And in fact, if they were forced to walk even further, then the soldier was held liable. But as he says, it's a beautiful scene to imagine a soldier asking for his backpack, but then the person insists on going another mile. When asked to carry a pack, Don't spit in the person's face, but walk with them, and walk with them even 2 miles instead of 1. Get to know them, not as an enemy, but as a person. Talk with them and woo them into our movement by your love. That is, if they'll break their own law to walk another mile with you. And then he says, in each of these instances, Jesus taught a third way. And we see how Jesus abhors both passivity and violence. I asked this question to a confirmation class one time. How many of you think that Jesus was just a nice guy? And a bunch of hands went up. Oh yeah. I said, how many of you think Jesus was a pushover? And then they kind of looked at each other, wondering what the right answer was. Because we have a tendency to reduce people being nice without people being firm. We have to remember the same Jesus who discusses these things also gets so disgusted with his own people when he walks into the temple that he starts kicking over the tables and screaming and shouting at them that they have turned his Father's house into a den of robbers, with every furor in his voice. And in some versions, he even makes a whip for himself. But what Shane says is this. Jesus ultimately is redirecting these things because he abhors both passivity and violence. He says this third way teaches that evil can be opposed without being mirrored. Oppressors can be resisted without being emulated. And enemies can be neutralized without being destroyed. So much of our politics today is about making someone of the other party an enemy and seeking to destroy them and insisting on one's absolute rightness and another's absolute wrongness. We call it political mudslinging, if you will. And one of the things that we have to do as Christians is to make sure that as we even engage in the political world, what is our third way? How can we oppose someone who we disagree with without mirroring their tactics? How can we resist one who would try to coerce us without emulating their ways? How can we neutralize our enemies without seeking to destroy them? Those are the things that I think we as Christians are challenged with every day as we go into a political season. And sometimes it means we have to make hard choices. And the choice that we have to make, I think now, as we're getting into this, we're almost just a little over a month away from this election, our presidential election coming up. That's the other offices, too, that we're voting for. How can we find that third way? I'll leave you with that tonight, and thank you for coming. I know we've covered a lot of heavy stuff, and I don't want to be just the talking head up here, so hopefully in these subsequent weeks, please email me if you have other questions that come up. If you have other questions that come up during the week, write those down so we can discuss those here next week as well. And we'll have our questions for week 3 posted up on the webpage. You can go and download those. Go to newburghumc.org and you can download those to think about those, our 4 questions that we'll be focusing on for next week, but your questions as well. So thank you for tuning in tonight. Let's stay engaged, but let's remember the one that we are truly following. Have a great evening, and we'll talk to you next week.
Of